Hi everyone, I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of DevX. This week we'll be breaking down the big headlines in global development and bringing in some top experts to help us do it. If you want to follow along with the stories we're talking about, check out DevX.com and subscribe to our daily newsletter, The Newswire. There's a link in the description. Follow us along on Twitter and you can see many of the stories we're talking about today, and we'd love to hear what you think. This is This Week in Global Development.
I'm Anna Gavell, Managing Editor of DevX, filling in for Raj Kumar this week. And I'm pleased to be joined by one of my colleagues, Rob Merrick. Hi, Rob. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well, thank you.
Great. So for those who don't know, I am based in Washington, D.C., and Rob is based in London. So we are both knee-deep in politics, not just at the moment, but really for the last year at least, and certainly for the many months ahead for both of us. Before we get into kind of the specifics of the election that's taking place today in the UK, Rob, I'm wondering if you can kind of talk to us a bit about this curious fellow named Ed Davey, who's been up to, I would say, kind of some antics on the campaign trail.
Yes, I will. I'm delighted to join you. It's a big day in the UK where the country is about to eject the right-wing Conservative Party and elect the left-of-centre Labour Party. We don't transfer power very often in the UK. I don't mind admitting I'm 54 years old. This is only the third time in my lifetime that power will have transferred from one to the other. So that is exciting by itself. But I guess what has lit up the campaign more than anything else, as you say, is the leader of what today will be the fourth party in British politics, the Liberal Democrats. So they have to work very, very hard to get noticed, of course. And that is what their leader, Ed Davey, has done in spectacular style. So we have seen him paddleboarding through sewage-infested waters and riding a bike with no hands and whizzing down children's slides into swimming pools and most memorably bungee jumping, which he looked very, very nervous when he was about to launch himself off the platform. But that's what he did, and he bounced a few times successfully and lived to tell the tale, and undoubtedly it has got him noticed. My own daughter, who was actually too young to have a vote, but she told me that if she had one, she would vote for the bungee jumping guy.
Well, maybe that's what we need over here is a little more bungee jumping, though. I would not recommend our two presidential candidates to jump off and go bungee jumping anytime soon. But that's a whole other matter. On a more serious note, like you said, Rob, this could is most likely to end 14 years of conservative rule. Can you talk just a bit about what is the mood you're sensing as voters head to the poll, and what's kind of the general lay of the land, if you will?
I guess the truth with almost all elections is that there's never any great feeling of excitement on the day. Perhaps afterwards, when one party has gone and another one has come in, then maybe people almost feel the excitement retrospectively. But it's been, with the exception of Ed Davey, a fairly dull campaign. So it'd be wrong to say that there's a mood of excitement in the country. But everybody knows that it is a big day. The Labour Party is coming in on a promise of change. It's after years of undoubted economic failure under the Conservatives, the collapse of public services, and scandal and disgrace. We've had a succession of prime ministers that almost nobody can remember how many we've had. There have been so many. So yes, it is a big moment. The Labour Party is promising change, but when it comes to aid and development, it's very, very difficult to see any meaningful change on the agenda. And that's one of the most interesting things, because it's been such a tumultuous period for aid and development in the UK, with the scrapping of the separate Department for International Development, with massive aid budget cuts. But at the moment, on the face of it, it's difficult to see that there's going to be dramatic change in that area under Labour.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. You've obviously covered the ups and downs of UK aid extensively for us, and there were these high hopes that Labour would restore the UK standing, if you will, as a premier donor. It accused the Conservatives of, as you've written, of degrading the international development portfolio over the last several years, and Labour, it does seem like it's very reticent about restoring aid spending to that kind of that marker of 0.7% of gross national income after conservatives famously cut it to 0.5%. And then on the other note, you mentioned, we've got the Department for International Development, what was DFID, but was folded into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, I think like around 3 years ago or something. Many said the UK's development efforts kind of lost their independence, their prestige, hemorrhaged a lot of experts when the merger happened. Can you talk a little bit, what are some of the options Labour might consider in terms of DFID? What are some of the arguments for and against restoring DFID as an independent entity? And like you said, is this kind of a done deal that it's going to be within the FCDO for the foreseeable future now, regardless of a Labour takeover?
Well, the short answer to the last question is yes, is that Labour has made its decision, and it's one that disappoints many of its own MPs, I suspect, and certainly its own supporters in the aid sector or across the wider aid sector. There's been a huge debate in Labour going on for 2 years. At one time, the leader, who tomorrow will be the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, promised that he would restore DFID, and people took him at his word. He dropped that promise. He then had a review into what should happen instead if there was not to be a separate aid department. And at that time, Labour was talking about what he called a new model for international development, arguing that if it didn't go back to full ring fencing from the Foreign Office, it would at least, or full separation, it would at least ring fence aid to give it proper independence rather than it having been subsumed so totally into this merged department. But we're not hearing any talk of the new model anymore. Instead, the decision is to stick with what we have. And interestingly, giving the reason that the Conservatives gave in the first place for bringing the departments together, the argument that development and diplomacy are two sides of the same coin, that both work most effectively when they work together, and that separation would have a cost in terms of the UK's wider diplomatic heft. Now, it's fair to say that is an argument that is not bought by many Labour MPs, and certainly not by most people in the aid sector in this country. They have kept quiet up until polling day, but I think we can expect some severe fights afterwards if Labour really does persist with this as you were policy.
And that's interesting what you talked about. Like, is it possible that some of this is the fact that Labour Party has not really stuck its neck out in terms of the campaign season, and that it might institute more specifics once it's elected into office? I mean, it seems like saying, at least in the US, saying you're going to increase foreign aid is not a good thing. It's not something that resonates with most voters. But so obviously it has not committed to going back to that 0.7%. But do you kind of see a scenario where once the dust settles, some of this might be reconsidered?
I suspect that the 0.7 commitment has gone for good. I see no prospect of the UK returning to spending 0.7% of income on aid under any party in the near future. It's going to be a desperate scramble to find the money for public services in this country in the years to come because of the state of the economy and those public services. As you say, that the public support is not there for spending that money on international aid instead. Just to go back briefly to the issue of the department, I think the key point is that Keir Starmer decided that it was simply not worth the cost and disruption of another institutional shakeup to restore the department. That is the crux of the real reason, perhaps, why the decision has been taken. Again, it's hard to see that decision would change. So I suspect, at least for the time being, it is a done deal. I think perhaps what's more interesting is, rather than perhaps looking what Labour has written on the tin, which is its short insert about international aid in its manifesto, is that the person who will be in charge of the merged Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, who, unless there's a huge surprise, will be a man called David Lammy, is a fascinating character who has very distinct and strong views about where development has gone wrong and how it needs to change. And he's calling himself, or he's preparing to be what he calls himself, as the first foreign secretary who is a descendant of the slave trade. He is the child of Caribbean parents, and he issues of identity and race and colonialism and the fallout from the British Empire are hugely important to him, and undoubtedly that will have a big knock-on effect into at least what are his core beliefs when it comes to development and aid, and that's something I hope to explore in an article for pro readers very soon.
And that's interesting that you bring that up, because it makes me instantly think of the issue, the lightning rod issue of migration, which obviously is huge on both sides of the Atlantic, if you will. Current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, as we know, spearheaded this plan to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda, which got all sorts of legal and human rights blowback. Keir Starmer, I believe, is a former human rights lawyer. You now have David Lammy. How do you think that Labour might alter the country's migration policies?
Well, when it comes to the Rwanda scheme, it's very simple. Labour will scrap it. It's been delayed and delayed. Although the legislation passed, it hasn't been formally introduced under the Conservatives, i.e. no migrants have been deported to Rwanda, and now none will, because the scheme will be scrapped. But beneath that is an unholy mess of immigration policy in this country that's going to take years to fix. So Labour doesn't really have a different policy to stop illegal migrants arriving. That's going to continue to be a huge issue for them. What's happened is that the system in this country has effectively collapsed, and their claims are not being processed, and so they simply sit in hotels, and really nobody in a state of limbo. Nobody knows what to do with them. Labour says it will at least assess their claims. It will restart the process. It will offer some hope of resolution to these people. But for those whose claims are dismissed, it's perhaps unclear what's going to happen. And the other crucial aspect of that is that an astonishing almost 1/3 of the aid budget in this country is now being spent not overseas, but being spent on the accommodation and subsistence bills of this enormous backlog of asylum seekers whose claims are not being processed. Labour will come under huge pressure to change that, to stop diverting 1/3 of the aid budget away from its original purpose. But again, I don't see any immediate prospect of change there. It will take years to sort out this unholy mess, and until then I think we can expect huge chunks of the aid budget to be spent domestically on those hotel costs.
Hi, I'm Kate Warren, Executive Editor at DevX. If you are listening to this podcast, you are likely working to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But are you subscribed to DevX Newswire? Global development can be a fast-moving, complex sector. Our team of global reporters work every day to bring you the news you need to make sense of it all. In DevX Newswire, we keep you up to date on issues ranging from climate change financing to gender equality and global health to transforming the food system, all in a fun-to-read, free newsletter delivered directly to you 5 days a week. Join the hundreds of thousands of global development professionals who receive DevX Newswire and visit devx.com/newsletters to sign up to this free newsletter today.
And certainly UK is not the only one who is making this controversial maneuver to use domestic housing for refugees and count that as ODA, official development assistance. There's another person that you've written about who would likely be the international development minister, which is Lisa Nandy. Something that stuck out to me was she at one point said that Labour would return spending to its original purpose of eliminating poverty. And in a lot of ways, this focus on poverty eradication kind of flies in the face of where the EU's assistance strategy is heading. Politico a few months ago leaked the European Commission's kind of draft vision of its development policy over the next 5 years, and it talked a lot about aid as being driven by economic and geopolitical concerns over this traditional development approach of fighting poverty, achieving the sustainable development goals. And for me, what's interesting is we're seeing this transactional mindset, certainly in the US, where Republicans want to really eviscerate what they see as progressive policy priorities and policies under Biden, such as climate change, gender equality. They would reward national security allies like Taiwan and Israel with foreign aid if President Trump theoretically would be elected. And then we go back to the issue of migration and specifically stopping it. And this is so much a part of this shift in politicizing aid. And, I always say migration is the fuel driving these right-wing populist movements on both sides of the Atlantic. And now we've got, kind of switching gears, I guess, to France. We have their elections on Sunday. And obviously we don't know what the right-wing National Rally Party would do if it wins, but I think we can safely say it would almost try to shut down France's borders to migrants. It would cut aid for poverty alleviation, climate change abroad. It would almost have this mirror of America First policy. And I think that that's really, in so many ways, concerning to our development community that we cover. Rob, what are some of your thoughts on the general aid trends that we're seeing in Europe with all of the elections taking place? And we had EU elections as well recently.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right that there is that divide between, on the one side, the EU's trend over several years, probably now to accelerate towards seeing aid as a transactional business, whereas in this country, under the outgoing Conservative International Development Minister Andrew Mitchell, there's been a marked shift back to a focus on alleviating poverty that makes it much easier for Labour to sort of pick up that policy and run with it without significant change in terms of its aims. I think most people would say, well, the UK might be willing to talk the talk, but where's the money? Perhaps at least the UK is talking the talk. When it comes to the rest of Europe, I think maybe the most interesting thing is that there was a widespread expectation that the European Parliament elections at the start of June would produce a significant lurch to the right, and that this trend of tying aid in particular to migration management, or even to go much further and to tie it to the returns of the migrants arriving in Europe, that would be what would happen going forward. In the end, that sort of predicted earthquake in Brussels didn't really happen. It was more of a tremor, but at the same time, the earthquake was taking place somewhere else, which was in domestic capitals. In the Netherlands, for example, which has elected a far-right anti-aid, anti-migrant coalition. In Germany, where there's been a huge shift to a far-right party, and as you say, most notably in France ahead of its final elections on Sunday. And I suppose that perhaps the key thing there is, although the European Union is a massive player in international development, the European Union is the sum of its parts. It depends upon who sits in power in the capitals of its member states. And France and Germany are the two drivers of the European Union, the most important countries. And yes, if the far right takes power in France, that's going to be what dictates future policy more than the makeup of the European Parliament in Brussels.
Exactly. And I think it's important to note that even under President Emmanuel Macron, he was already cutting aid, foreign aid, as was, Germany is another generous aid donor, was already cutting aid. We've covered that quite a bit. And as you mentioned, Netherlands, which is actually the world's 7th largest donor, a traditional champion of foreign assistance. But under its new right-wing coalition government, the odds are pretty high that it's going to slash aid as well. And again, I kind of go back a lot to the parallels with the United States. There's going to be programs such as sexual reproductive health spending, climate change spending that will probably be on the chopping block. And of course, we go back to curbing migration. Our colleague Vince Chadwick noted that in the Netherlands, there could be a new emphasis on returning refugees to the regions of their origin. So this kind of echoes Rishi Sunak's Rwanda policy. So, I mean, it just kind of goes to show you this is going to be a really difficult and very uncertain environment for development advocates to navigate. Rob, I'm wondering if you have any kind of closing thoughts before we wrap up today.
I suppose my overwhelming thought is that I've been struck in conversations in recent weeks and months that I think many people in the aid sector, certainly in the UK, that they know that the idea of spending 0.7% of aid has gone and that it's not coming back in the near future. And for them, the debate has very much shifted. That isn't really their focus anymore. I think their focus is more on issues, perhaps in particular debt, trying to relieve debt, tackling dirty money from the City of London and the tax havens in British overseas territories, and the way that fuels bad governance in lower income countries, and perhaps seeing those sorts of issues as, if not the solutions, at least the areas in which progress can be made, rather than trying to revive a debate about the size of the state's aid budget, which they think is lost.
Yeah, and that's a very relevant point to some of the coverage that we've had in terms of what's next for foreign aid. A lot of talk is on mobilizing private sector capital. We recently had an event with the head of the Development Finance Corporation here in the US, and that's one of the rare areas of convergence, if you will, between Republicans and Democrats, and Republicans especially, and of pushing for these foreign aid agencies that aren't all about assistance. They're more about lending and private capital mobilization. So that also could be kind of a future trend that we see taking place really among all of the major donors. So, well, before we wrap up, I wanted to just kind of switch gears and point out two very important stories that we ran this week, which focused on the use of child advocates in development. It is a common practice, and young voices are obviously very powerful activists. Their opinions are vital to the discussion. But it was interesting to me personally to read that their advocacy comes with a lot of dangers. There's online harassment, mental burnout, even death threats. So we talked to many child advocates about the pros and cons of their work and how NGOs can work with them safely. So I would encourage our readers to check that out. And to check out all of our stories this week, please be signed up to our daily newsletter, Newswire, which I have the privilege of writing a few times a week. Rob writes it as well. So please be sure to sign up to that so that you're caught up on all of our latest news. And in the meantime, Rob, good luck with everything today. And in the months ahead, we'll be looking forward to your coverage. And thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Right, and thank you, everyone else. And we'll see you next week.
This has been This Week in Global Development. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe using the link in the description. To get even more coverage and analysis on the most pressing development issues of the day, become a DevX Pro member by going to devx.com/membership and signing up. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.